Welcome to this week's OK at Work with myself, Sarah Sawyer, and my colleague, Russell Berger, attorneys at Offit Kurman. And today we are talking about COVID testing. So over the last couple of years, it's been a little while since we talked about COVID actually on OK at Work, but over the last couple of years, the EEOC's guidance has been pretty broad, or allowed pretty broad testing, I should say, around COVID and testing employees before they come into the workplace to ensure that they're not COVID positive. And, when at the peak of COVID, when it was especially pre-vaccines and things, and the more that we had ability to test, the EEOC had allowed for broad testing that was not necessarily, without having to do an in-depth analysis and assuming that it was going to be job related, no matter what, just given that we were in a pandemic. However, they have recently rolled back that guidance and offered some additional guidance on COVID testing. What are we seeing under the new guidance, Russell?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, it's been nice to not have to talk about COVID for a while. Unfortunately, the case counts are going up. Obviously, the severity is not necessarily following at the same trends, which is great news. But I figure it's a good time to circle back on COVID-19 in the workplace, just simply because we're seeing more of it. And as a general reminder, regardless of the testing question, if there's people who are positive, if there's close contacts, we still recommend following CDC guidance when it comes to those things. So making sure you're staying on top of that's still important. So even though maybe you've gotten a little more lax with some of the protocols or the rules for who can come into your workplace, making sure that you're dealing with COVID when it pops up is still really important. And then with respect to testing, under the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, there are limited times where an employer can make what's known as a technical term, a medical examination of an employee, and that generally has to do with the medical examination being job related and consistent with a business necessity. And as Sarah, as you alluded to, it's kind of been a given with COVID up until recently, and so the change is the EEOC is now saying you can still do a medical examination, but you have to make out this business necessity test. And when you're talking about business necessity, you have to look at a whole bunch of factors. And those factors include things like the level of transmission within your community, vaccination status of the people involved, the testing, accuracy, speed, even if people are vaccinated, the risk of breakthrough, cases of COVID, like right now, it seems like the variant that we're dealing with is highly communicable, even if it's maybe not as severe. So, you have to factor that in as well. So basically, you got to take everything that's going on, include, both at the COVID macro level as well as in your workplace, and you got to assess it and go through a process to evaluate whether there is a legitimate business need for the testing.
Yeah, and the EEOC has stated that it's not intending to say that testing is no longer necessary or job related, but it's really just not that it's automatic as it was in the past. So it's a little bit more. You got to go through the process, make sure you document that, just like with anything with the ADA. Or anything medical related you might be doing otherwise, just to document these things, make sure you actually go through the process and make a case-by-case assessment instead of just kind of this broad ability to just do the test. And so it will add a little bit of an extra step, but for a lot of workplaces that still could very much be warranted, especially when in-person operations are necessary. I mean, that's something that we've seen throughout the pandemic and now, that any employers that have in-person operations are reliant on people definitely being in person and being close to each other. We always, assembly lines and different things like that come to mind, and people that have to be in the workplace, that those are going to be the more natural fits for some of these things, as opposed to people who can work remotely and testing may not be as necessary.
Yeah, and we should point out that there's testing in different types of situations. There's general testing to get into the workplace. There's testing when you're a close contact. There's testing when you're symptomatic. And, I don't think anything the EEOC is saying really pertains to, a symptomatic person testing or a close contact testing. I think this has more to do with more generalized testing, because I think the business need is the necessity is very apparent when there's a symptomatic person or there is a close contact. And again, that would be consistent with the CDC guidelines on those points.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Russell, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sarah.